Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome back to Cutting the Distance. My newfound obsession may be white-tailed deer. Please don't tell my wife. I need another obsession like nothing else, but it was pretty fun. An animal I've always joked about hunting when I turned 70 years old and can no longer chase mule deer, blacktails, or elk around. So I've started to dig up all the information that's out there because that's kind of where all of my hunting starts. I want to know about the animal before I go out there. And there's one name that always seems to come up as an expert on whitetail biology, does a ton of research on them, Dr. Bronson Strickland. He's a professor of wildlife management at Mississippi State University. He's the co-director of MSU's Deer Lab and the co-host of Deer University podcast. And I brought him on today to kind of pick his brain a little bit, see how we can use these bigger bucks, their biology, their instincts against them in the fall. So welcome to the show, Dr. Strickland.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Were you able to get out in the woods this year and hunt at all, or just
well,
watch them?
It's really just beginning here. I mean, gun season just began. And it's finally cooling down. You know, when I was younger, even if it was 90 degrees during bow season, I would go out of obligation. The older I get, though, I like to wait for colder weather. So it's finally getting right down here.
Perfect. I always forget, down in the Southeast, you guys' rut's a little bit later. Your seasons are a little bit later, so that makes a ton of sense. I know I was in Kansas 10 days ago, and the cold snap had hit there. We were in the single digits, low teens for a lot of that, and the rut was cranking along pretty good there between the 10th and about the 15th. So yeah, I guess your season's still coming up. But I'm going to ask you to just kind of kick off the podcast. Give us a quick rundown on kind of your history and how you got to where you are now to be respected as knowledgeable as you are on whitetails and what's led you to this point.
Well, I'm really lucky. I'm just really, really lucky that I grew up in a place and time to where being a whitetail researcher and a biologist and outreach specialist is a job. And so got my degrees at University of Georgia, Texas A&M Kingsville, and Mississippi State, and it's all focused on wildlife management and specifically whitetail deer. And then lucky again that I could get a job here at Mississippi State where I could keep focusing on deer research and then the outreach component of that. And that is basically just taking all the research that we do and putting it out in various forms, articles, presentations, books, podcasts, etc. So that's kind of the heart of what I do.
Thanks for that rundown. And as a civil engineer myself, I love when you can take research, you can take data and apply that to what I see in the field. I had a great professor going through school where it's like, we're going to teach you everything that's in these books, the theory, the science, but then to go out and proof that research and data on the ground, in this instance, to ultimately grow bigger bucks, find bigger bucks, understand bigger bucks, the same thing on the engineering side. So as an engineer, this stuff really gets me when you're able to add facts, data, research to what we're trying to do. I really like this stuff. So I appreciate having you on. So like every Cutting the Distance podcast, we're going to field a few questions from you, the listeners. And if you have a question of your own to submit, please email us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com or send us a message on social media, email. We'll do our best to either have me or, in this case, our expert guests answer these questions, because I'm not quite versed enough on these whitetail deer yet to answer these questions. So our first question for you, Bronson: at what age should you start managing your bucks? And by that I mean, we have identified the age, we've identified what they've got on their head. What's the right time to make a good decision that deer is now ready to be taken out of the herd?
If you listen to any of our media or read any of our articles, my colleague and friend Steve Damaris, he's also co-director of the Deer Lab, we say it depends probably more than any little phrase, and essentially that means context. You got to put some context and some boundaries on it. But if we were going to say on the average, I think for most people in most places is at 3.5. At 3.5 years of age, depending on where you're at, a buck is showing 60 to sometimes 70 or greater % of what he's going to be at maturity. And so 3.5 is a good age because we now have a reliable predictor of what he's going to be a couple years down the road. Simultaneously, it takes a few years to forgive some of the issues that may have happened to the buck's mother when it was a fawn or while it was a yearling. Was it born late? Was it born in a drought year? Et cetera, et cetera. It takes a couple years to grow out of that circumstance the buck was born into. And so just very much in general, I would say 3.5 would be the single most important age where you make a decision of, do I want to harvest this buck? I don't think it has a lot of potential, or am I going to make sure I spare this buck and we protect this buck because he is definitely demonstrating he has a lot of potential to be trophy class at maturity?
That makes a ton of sense. And to piggyback onto that question a little bit of my own, do environmental factors start to play in? Like, as a land manager, is somebody trying to manage the herd? We were in, as I keep referring back to my one and only trip in Kansas, they were coming off of a pretty bad drought. And that was going through everybody's mind. Tines were a little bit shorter. Things, they had saw deer, 5 single-digit % increase in horns, on their head. Do you take that into effect as you're looking at that? Like, if you get a good moisture year in the drought and they're able to get the minerals, back out of the ground and the water sources, whatever, that may be, are you going to let that play in? And maybe, should we hold off on managing those deer, knowing that they may have a big rebound? Maybe they'll come back 20-25% bigger because of a drought situation. Or, they also were talking about their beans didn't come up. And so they missed a quarter or 25% of their typical food source that fattens them up. Is that going to play into when you're going to harvest, or maybe give them that extra year?
Yeah, and I would say that's going to be manifested in two ways. It's going to affect the deer on the hoof that year. So if you're talking about drought or beans, you're talking about something during the summer, during the antler growth period, and it is going to influence their maximum antler size when they harden out, shed their velvet that fall. It's also going to influence buck fawns as well. And so that, again, that early environment they're into can put them on a different trajectory of growth for several years in their life. So two different ways. But I guess, Jason, one way you have to think about that too is how big is big enough? And so you always have to think about that opportunity of, hey, my goal is a 180 or 170 or 190, whatever it is. I have this buck in front of me at 25 yards, bow in my hand, and he's 20 inches less than what he could be, but I have the opportunity right now for a lethal shot. So you got to play the probability, the odds.
Yeah. Yeah, you're playing that game, and you at that point, he's 20 inches less, but you still outsmarted a deer that was, if that's what you're trying to do, you're outsmarted him. He's still the same deer, regardless of what's on his head, and that's
and you have to factor in risk. There is no guarantee that he's going to be around next year. There's a lot of other non-hunting mortality sources that could take him, so you're rolling the dice when you let him go.
Yep. Yep. And now you may not have an answer for this, but you kind of, we have a lot of winter kill out west, big snows, and you have age classes of deer missing. What you just touched on there a little bit is, in a drought year, do people manage to the point knowing that their bucks that in 4.5 years or 4 years are going to have, those bucks may not have the potential? I mean, are people managing to that level that buck or that buck fawn was born during a drought, his genetic potential, or not, it wouldn't be genetic, his potential because of the mom's health is now going to be lessened in 4 years when I want to hunt, or 5 years when I want to hunt a buck of that age class?
Probably not many. I think that's more of a biologist look at it when they have an aggregation of data at a very large scale. You can kind of explain from year to year, what proportion of the annual variation in average antler size is explained by the events this year, and what can we go back to the year of birth, and you just kind of partition that. There's probably, Jason, not that many in the Southeast that would take that into account. But if you go to a situation like in South Texas, it may not be looking at, hey, we probably have antlers are 5% less than they would have been. It's that you literally have cohorts of deer missing, much like what you described out west with winter kill. And so you may have 2 or 3 years where there was no cohort of bucks coming through the population. And so that's probably the biggest effect I see.
Gotcha. That makes sense. This is playing a big impact on my life for a sheep hunt right now. I've got planned for 24s. They had some bad winters 3 or 4 years ago. I was planning on a 24, and there's a band of sheep missing. Well, when you're going sheep hunting, you need a certain age, and there is a complete band miss. So I've got way more familiar with years and bad years, but we'll roll into this next question from our listeners. Everyone is interested in what food to plant during that deer season, that September, October, November, even into December, when you're going to be hunting them. What can you bring that deer, in front of your stand, in front of your blind? But what should hunters really be looking at to improve the overall health of the herd? And by that, I mean year-round food. And if it makes it easier, maybe break it down by season. Like, we know their enzymes change, their ability to break down certain foods change. What's like an ideal feeding plan or a crop plan look like?
Well, I'm going to give you my typical speech here. So if it sounds a little scripted, it's because I've said it before many times. What we preach, because we know it works, is that the focus should be on habitat management. The focus should be on habitat and the number of deer utilizing that habitat. So your density has to be appropriate. Well, once you address that, you move into habitat that encourages, promotes, facilitates the growth of, the technical term for us is called a forb, F-O-R-B, which is just a broadleaf plant, a non-grass herbaceous plant. That is the majority of the deer diet. And when you produce that and the diversity of all those forbs on the landscape, that, by the way, are very drought tolerant. So you see a lot of resilience in your habitat and deer herd when you provide the naturally occurring foods that they want to eat. So now let's take care of that, or say we have taken care of that. Now we move into, we say food plots. I like to call them supplemental food plots because they should supplement the habitat. And this is going to vary from region to region and latitude and et cetera. But the bottom line is, you got to grow plants that grow in your environment. Whether it be you have a really wet area, you have a really dry area, cold, etc., soil types, all that. Find the group of plants that grows really well, and typically it comes down to this: you're going to be able to find one of several cereal grains, wheat, oats, rye, etc. They typically grow well everywhere. Couple that with some type of clover, and again, that depends on where you're at. Deer love them, and there's always a clover that works really well. And then also a brassica, typically some type of brassica as well. And when you mix those together, literally either in a mix within the plot or spread them out in different plots, that I've never seen a case where that didn't work well. They grow well, it attracts deer, high nutrition, it's just win-win-win.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense as a good mixture. And I like the idea of supplemental. It's like, they should have what they need on the ground, and then your plot should just add to that nutrition, add to that, and then for hunting purposes, maybe draw them to that area during the seasons.
Sure.
Because I was driving around this area of Kansas and kind of scratching my head because you would have a 200-acre tillable field with hedgerows. There were deer in that. And then you'd go to my buddy's place that was 90% timber with 10% food plots. There were deer in that. You'd have his neighbor that didn't do any management to their land, but maybe an old CRP field, and there were deer in that. And I'm like, well, maybe these deer use all of them, but it's like 3 different scenarios with properties stacked together, and they all had deer on them. And so I'm like, well, maybe there isn't a magic solution. Like as long as they have enough of what they need, you're going to hold deer and you're going to keep them. I'm sure there's probably not the magic answer, but there's probably things that they prefer or things that will, keep those deer healthier, growing a little bit, bigger on your land. So it's just one of those things where to see 3, different landscapes all hold deer,
Yeah. And then you've got another way you can kind of qualify that as well. It might have been on one of the properties you described where it may not have been managed as well and there was just an old CRP field. For one thing, deer are going to eat what is available to them. So you could take the deer and move them to a different property. They may not eat the forage they were eating on the first property, but it's the only thing palatable they had available to them as well.
So they'll make do with what they've got. And
well, they have to.
Yeah,
they have to make do.
So I guess I'm out west we can see mule deer go 3 or 4 miles a day, but these whitetail, they don't have that home range. They're going to stick to a little bit tighter range. They're going to make like you said, they have to make do with what they've got.
That's right. And we they can definitely move a long ways, but the way generally there's always exceptions, but generally they have seasonal home ranges. And generally that's going to be, depending on buck or doe, age, et cetera, about 1,000 acres, some 500, some 2,500. But yeah, so it's like within that home range, within that season, they know what is on the landscape and is available to them, and they're going to pick the best.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Some of the research I've read, I can't remember if you specifically, but some deer move 900 yards and then some deer, up to 1,500 yards during the rut. And I'm like, shoot, I've had mule deer like blow through that, in an evening or a night. So a little bit different, but appreciate you answering those user questions. Once again, if you have questions of your own, please submit those questions to ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com, and we'll do our best to either have myself or one of our guests answer those. So now we're going to jump into some of my personal questions I have, and I'm going to apologize ahead of you, to you, Dr. Strickland, and to all of our listeners. These are going to jump around, but these are like my personal questions, things that, as I'm sitting in a tree stand trying to relate what I know about hunting, what I know about animals, and just some of the stuff that goes through, and some of the stuff we've heard. So I'm going to kind of just go through this list of questions and see what you got for answers.
Okay.
I was mentioning to you previous to the podcast, kind of, I get things stuck in my head from what I've experienced. And this first one, it kind of piggybacks on some conversations I had with Kevin Monteith on, I was talking to Steve Ranella about this when we were on a Coues deer hunt. And I'm like, it doesn't make any sense from what I've seen. But my question will be, how much of a buck's potential is genetic? How much is that mother's health during pregnancy, the available nutrition, both food and minerals, environmental conditions, etc.? And I know it probably varies. It's determined. But if you had to kind of break those out, what would you say are the factors that give you that potential of, that buck has the ability to get to 200 inches, but, environmental affects it? I know it's a big loaded question, but if you can try to break that down for us.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly try. Yeah, and a word we use in the science fields is, we think about variation and partitioning. How do we slice up the pie? And, we can, and there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but we can start with what's heritability. What's the heritability of antler characteristics from father to son, et cetera. And, that can be 20 or 30%. We know, of course, the mother is half of the equation. So you can have a father with Boone and Crockett antlers and a mother that sires offspring that is half that, and we're going to get something in the middle. And that's what makes, the culling for genetics and so forth that people try to do is, I shot that buck to get it out of the gene pool. That's why that doesn't work. It's because you can make no selection with the female. So there is a baseline genetic component of course. The example you gave is 200 inches of antler. Well, yeah, that buck has genes that are coding for that amount of antler growth. But that antler growth is influenced and either suppressed or enhanced by the environment, but by its food. Is it dealing with a disease issue? All those things are very influential. And so I guess, Jason, the way we think about it is we probably say half and half. There's a lot of this, about half of it, and that's buck and the mom and the father, etc. But then the other half is the nutrition available to the deer that year. And you mentioned Kevin Monteith, something he did when he was a graduate student, something we've done at the MSU Deer Lab is demonstrating the influence of what we call the intergenerational, generation after generation after generation of nutrition. And that is also what is influencing, the term is epigenetics, but that is also is an organism, in this case a deer, may have the genes for 180 inches of antler, but because the mother was experiencing nutritional or environmental stress while this little buck fawn was in womb, her signals are basically telling the fetus or the genes that you don't need to express yourself fully. And so that buck will never reach its full potential because of these cues in the uterine environment of its mother are suppressing the expression of those genes. And I hope I didn't go off the rails that they're too complicated, but it is a complicated question.
Yeah, no, and I'm super interested in it. It's like, I don't want to say we're out there chasing, horns, but we're chasing mature deer. And it's one of those things that I always try to wrap my head around. Like, what is the genetic potential? Like, are we shooting a deer before his genetic potential? Could he ever have got bigger? So I'm going to roll some things by and you can either correct me or, maybe agree with them. So as a buck, he's got a genetic potential and is, from my understanding, like years 1 through 3, he grows that skeleton out. He's growing, and then years 3 to 5, 3 to 4.5, he's typically trying to add muscle onto that skeleton, become the biggest, baddest buck, which genetically ensures that he'll have his chance to breed, right? That's why he's putting on muscle. He's packing on muscle. That gives him the ability, in the pecking order to be able to breed. And so are we going to always experience... And so they're using energy, they're using effort, they're using fat stores, they're using, I guess energy, for lack of a better word, to grow skeleton, to grow bone, either in their body, or they're using it to grow muscle on their body, to pack on muscle. And then are we always going to get that buck's best potential? Now, I guess let's assume environmental conditions have been the same every year he's been alive, so we can take that out. No droughts, the food's been the same. Are we typically always going to get their best horn growth 6.5 and 7.5 years old, or can that vary as well? Like, or, I use the example of, your buddy Don Higgins' buck Hal that was over 200 inches as a 3-year-old. Like, that buck was just destined to be a giant, but I don't want to knock on it because the year he let it go to the year he shot it, but it didn't grow percentage wise much more than, it was less than 10% between 3 and 4, how do you guys, how does the research support that? Like, are we, is there a correlation that you're going to get your best horn growth at 6.5 or 7.5? Yeah,
and I got to qualify here. We always have to say is that we deal with averages. We deal with the population response and not individuals, because individuals do wacky things just like human beings. But yeah, on the average, 5, 6, 7. Is going to be the point, and this is, I guess, the point I'd make, Jason. Not that they're reaching their peak and then soon after there's going to be a decline. It's where they reach their maximum, that is the plateau, for many, many years to come. Now, there are definitely some individual deer, and I think this happens more often in the Midwest and even in Mississippi. And our ag regions versus our forested regions, you will see them maximizing their antler size about a year earlier then you will. So in other words, in our southern part of our state, you need to let them get 6 to 7. And in our ag region of the state, the Delta region, probably 4 or 5 is plenty sufficient. But the thing that's interesting to me, Jason, is that, and I can say this because you qualified earlier, let's take nutrition, the stability, the availability of nutrition out of the equation. If you're in our deer research facilities, basically you will have from 5 to 6 until 9 or 10, and to where antler size hardly decreases at all. And so you've got a 4 or 5 year window where they maximize.
So you hold that. It's not a peak, it's a plateau up there.
It's a plateau.
And then one thing you see is, maybe some kickers, shorter tines, longer tines, no kickers. They clean up, they add on, but they typically stay, like you said, they say about the same amount of inches there, plus or minus a few percentage, but change configurations a little bit, add mass, lose length, or combinations there.
And that's one of those things that's very visible that doesn't get as much credit on Boone and Crockett's score is the mass, and specifically the mass in the tines. There's no measurement for the circumference of the tine, but man, that really looks impressive when you get a 6 or 7 year old buck. And then also the character points, the splits, the drops, and stuff like that. Yeah, you see that at maturity more often.
We've all seen plenty of gadgets and fads come and go, but here's one product that stood the test of time: Seafoam Motor Treatment. Lots of hunters and anglers know that seafoam helps engines run better and last longer. It's really simple. When you pour it in your gas tank, seafoam cleans harmful fuel deposits that cause engine problems. I'm talking common stuff like hard starts, rough engine performance, or lost fuel economy. Seafoam is an easy way to prevent or overcome these problems. Just pour a can in your gas tank and let it clean your fuel system. You probably know someone who has used a can of seafoam to get their truck or boat going again. People everywhere rely on seafoam to keep their trucks, boats, and small engines running the way that they should the entire season. Help your engine run better and last longer. Pick up a can of seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
I've heard things, a spike's always a spike, which kind of blows my mind, especially growing up here in the blacktail woods, because it just, in my opinion, doesn't hold true. But, that same deer talking about, I think I called it Hal earlier, Mel or whatever the name of that deer was, Dawn had video of it as a 1.5-year-old, and he's already a 10-point. And that kind of blew my mind, because around here, it's like you're a spike at 1.5 years, you're a small 2-point at 2.5. How much can we tell from a deer at 1.5 years old? Like, is that starting to show genetic potential? Or, I mean, obviously in this case it was, but can that same, spike with eye guards that's running around on a piece of property blossom out to be a great, deer horn wise, at 4.5, 5.5?
I think the safe way to deal with that is that if he is really big as a yearling, I would say 99.9% of the time he's going to be a monster when he's mature. But you can't say just because it has below average or a spike or a fork or whatever at a yearling, that in no way guarantees that you're not going to have a 150 or greater buck at maturity. But Jason, let me circle back around to individuals versus population averages. So even here at the Deer Lab, Harry Jacobson, years ago, our predecessor, he had a great example in the southeast where it was if you see a spike yearling, it's always going to be terrible. You need to shoot every spike. Well, he had an example of a little spike yearling that ended up growing over 200 inches. That was an individual. But what we have shown is that on the average, if you have below average yearling antler size versus above average yearling antler size, the above average will at maturity be above average, and the below average at maturity will be below average. What you have to decide is below average still a good enough buck for you? In other words, I'm okay with a 120 or 130 inch buck. That's okay for me. But if your sole purpose or goal, objective is I only want 150s or above, then the best bet you can make is an above average yearling is going to be that.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, like you said, you're just going with what, the average is, and what typically will happen. That 200-inch buck's probably a little bit of an anomaly, in the data, but it proves that it can happen. So I know the place I was hunting, they don't manage at the 1.5-year-old, as we talked earlier. They're managing more. They're not even managing at the 2.5-year-old. At 3.5-year-old, you start to have 6 points or, small 8 start to come out. That's when he decides, that those bucks need to be managed or taken out. So that makes a ton of sense. We're going to move on to managing does, and coming from out west, especially, the blacktails that are in my area, Southwest Washington now, we aren't near carrying capacity. So my thought has always been, those are the baby makers. We don't manage does here. And then you hear about people managing does, whether it's me watching a whitetail show on TV or on YouTube, whatever it may be. And they're just, laying out does. And it never made sense to me until you go out, go back to the Midwest and just see just how many deer are on the landscape compared to what we have here. And it starts to make a lot of sense. So my first question on this is, and I know I know how these are. I'm in the same boat, when you're doing, scientific type stuff, and it's going to depend on where you're at, landscape, food availability. But what is a typical good buck to doe ratio to maintain, good herd health?
Probably something like, if you can achieve and maintain 1-to-1, then that's fantastic.
Ideal.
It probably also enables you to keep the population under control more easily if you can do that. But we commonly see fantastic properties where they have 1.5 to 2 does per buck. When you start getting above that, and that's a little bit of a misnomer, Jason, is that you hear and read that a lot, that the sex ratio is just really out of whack and there's 10 does for every buck. Well, that can only occur if you're looking at adults, not including fawns, and at the end of the deer season. Because Mother Nature has a self-correction built in there, because all those does are going to put fawns on the ground and half of them are bucks. So numerically, it's really hard to maintain some 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 7-to-1, because it's a self-correcting, type system.
That makes a ton of sense. I guess my own concern is like, well, what if, you leave those does on there, they get bred and they're the ones that produce the next 200-inch buck. But I also understand, once again, we're going back to averages, your best bet, the research probably shows if you can keep that doe to buck ratio, or buck to doe ratio at 1-to-1, 1-to-2, your bucks are going to be healthier. They're going to be able to, realize their potential a little bit better. So for me, I'm like, I want as many deer on the ground as possible, as long as the food supports them. But I guess, rut, other things, competitiveness for that ground, all of that comes into play, and probably isn't that healthy, for your herd. So,
well, you hit the nail on the head, Jason. Just want to emphasize something you said. You said a little clause there that I think is important. As long as the habitat will support them. That's the single most important thing. What's the optimal density, etc.? Well, it depends on, is deer quality going to diminish incrementally as the number of deer increases? And so if the deer population increases and simultaneously deer quality decreases, you've got too many deer. You need to take some deer off.
All right, that's a great segue. We were rolling right into my next question, which once again, you have to preface all of this, right? Because where you're at in, Southeast Mississippi is going to be different than what we're doing in the Midwest, Kansas, Iowa, Kentucky, Illinois, whatever it may be. Let's just assume we're in the middle of Kansas. We've got a good mix, a well-managed farm, good ag, good cover. We've hinge cut all of our bottoms. We've got everything that a big whitetail needs. What's a carrying capacity? Because one of the things, we were going out there, with our doe tags and we were shooting the does that he needed killed. But there was, out here we do, aerial studies, helicopter flights on the winter range. what's the right number? What is the carrying capacity on a well-managed 100 acres? And then how do we monitor that? As hunters or good stewards of our farm, what's a good way to manage that and be somewhat scientific about it?
So you're right. I am going to respond with a contextual. It depends, and I don't really have a numerical response for you, because there have been places I've been to, and people express deer density differently depending on where you're at in the country. If you're in the East, it's deer per square mile here, and in Texas and other places, we use acres per deer. And I have been to properties where they might have 7 or 8 acres per deer, and they are in superb condition. I've been to other places where you might estimate at 20 acres per deer, and the deer herd is in terrible condition. So it's all based on habitat quality. So I'm often asked, Jason, is, without having a lot of familiarity with the property, how many does do I need to kill? That's just kind of the default, the response in the Southeast. How many does do I need to kill? And people probably get frustrated when I say, I can't give you that number, but because I don't know what the habitat is telling me. And most importantly, and you said a moment ago, how do we scientifically go about determining that? I don't think you need to learn about population estimation techniques. I think you need to learn to examine what you can learn at the skinning shed after you harvest deer. Look at their condition, look at their body weight, and make it relative to what you have recorded over time and what your neighbor is doing. That's how you determine how many to kill.
Yeah, and what you just hit on a point we'll talk about a little bit later. Matter of fact, it's right here. I was talking to my buddy Randy, who owns these properties, and I showed some interest in wanting to buy some Midwest property, and he's like, the main thing is, like, don't worry about what you can do with your property. Like, pay very close attention to what your four neighbors are doing, or whoever touches your piece of property, because that's going to be the biggest the biggest factor on being able to keep big bucks on your property, not letting them if they're shooting everything that's 3.5, all of that plays in. But I had one more question, which does tie into neighbors as well, is as I was sitting in the stand, we're trying to shoot these does, and these seasons are long in the Midwest compared to our 2-week seasons, 1-week seasons. So you don't see the pressure spikes like we see, but I'm like, the neighbors don't appear to be hunting at all. Like, we get to see their roads on the way in to our places. If they're not harvesting their does, are we going to lose, this well-managed piece of property? Are our bucks going to leave, or do they have enough does to deal with? In my mind, well, if there's, the neighbor has twice as many does, are we going to lose our bucks to them? Like, is there any, anything that supports that buck staying on his home range and being completely content with breeding the does that were available? Or is that buck going to start running ridge lines and leave my property or leave the property?
I think it's very difficult to manage that situation. And I have thought, and Steve and I have gone back and forth for years about this. And the way I would advise someone is I would be just making sure that you manage your property with the appropriate density, as we said earlier, to maximize the quality of both your bucks and does. That is what is in your control. That is what you can do. It is absolutely going to be successful. Your neighbor running a higher doe density than maybe you, yeah, it is going to happen. You can take it to the bank that 1 or 2 or some fraction of your bucks are going to spin off because they've put their nose in the air in the prevailing wind, and they can tell a doe is in heat, and they're going to leave your property, and they're going to get shot. They absolutely are. Yep. But I think that is a short-term negative. What I think turns into a long-term negative is now I'm going to manage my property with a whole bunch of deer and a whole bunch of does and diminish the quality of the entire herd because of that instance that may happen every year, every other year, where your buck leaves the property and gets killed. Now you've shot yourself in the foot, management-wise.
Yep. Yeah, that makes. I mean, you're calculating. You're betting on what has the best potential to produce big bucks. And so, like you said, it sounds like herd health's number one. and you just have to accept that you're going to lose maybe, a buck or two that you wanted to try to kill to a neighboring property. But overall, that's going to give you the best chances on your well-managed piece of property to take that, same buck or
That's
a
the
buck that doesn't
long-term,
leave.
sustainable way to do it. Absolutely.
Okay. So we've decided we've got to harvest does. We had a few conversations in the blind. What is the right doe to take? And once again, I don't want to say that I was above shooting a yearling, but it's like going into it, you're like, oh, you want to shoot the biggest, oldest doe, get some meat off of her. And Randy kind of alludes like, I don't mind shooting a yearling doe at all. And for the reasons of, you may want to elaborate on whether there's a second rut or a later rut, but my understanding is the older does or the more mature does will come in, earlier, all kind of at the same time. And then we get those, 2.5-year-old, year-and-a-half-old does that will maybe come in later, late November, early December. And Randy's frustration was, or not frustration, but his concern was it now has his bigger bucks chasing, does for an extra month. And we've all seen it where you kill a buck, mid-October, he's got layers of fat on him. You kill a buck mid-November and it's completely gone. Well, now you've got to add an entire month of chasing onto that. So Randy was like, I have no problem shooting a mature doe. I have no problem shooting a yearling doe. What's your thought on, is there a right age class of does to take out? Or my other concern to Randy, not to ramble on with my question, was if you leave the mature does, you've now just taken a band of a certain age class of does out. Like, do you want, to me, it would seem like the best way is just to be pretty random about it. But what's your thought on, is there a prime candidate or what should the management strategy be on taking does out?
Well, I'm going to one up your buddy Randy. Not only do I not mind shooting a yearling doe, I'll shoot a doe fawn. That does not even come into my thinking about pulling the trigger. I've got to ensure it is a doe fawn and not a buck fawn, but man, that's some good eating right there. It gets you a couple doe fawns. That to me, Jason, is it's one of those things that makes better discussion than practically you can implement. So here's a couple scenarios, for example. Let's say I'm on a property or area where fawn recruitment is an issue. So think of your more arid places where you might be skipping some fawn crops, or you might have an average of 1 fawn to 4 does. Then in that case, if you even needed to shoot a doe, you probably don't. But let's just say you were going to make a decision. I would be wanting to shoot the doe that did not have a fawn at heel, whether it be a yearling or 2-year-old, because in that context, those older mothers with fawn at heel have demonstrated that they have the cover and food, that they know how to raise a fawn. They know how to recruit a fawn into the population. Now you can turn right around to an area like a lot of places in the southeast where dealing with deer density is always a problem. And I can only shoot one, let's say, for whatever reason. I can only shoot one, outwalk 3. There's a doe fawn, there's a yearling or a 2-year-old with no fawn, and there's an adult doe with 2 fawns. If I'm trying to slow down the reproductive engine of that population, it's probably wiser to shoot that older doe. I'm probably going to, because next year I will probably have recruited less fawns the following year by killing that older productive doe.
That makes a ton of sense. So maturity of that doe doesn't necessarily matter. You're looking for, what your management needs to be, whether it's less does or less fawns, more fawns, and you're basing that if you had to pick, one way or the other.
Yeah, if I had to. Another way, depending on what state you're in, another way to say it is if you need to kill a bunch, shoot all 3. Shoot the doe fawn, the yearling, and the adult.
Take out the whole group.
Now, I didn't go into this episode intending to leave you hanging, but there was just so much good information we had to break this into 2 parts. Tune in next time for part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Bronson Strickland.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.